Sometimes the world's cruelest judgment becomes heaven's sweetest mercy. Elsbeth had spent 60 years believing she was unworthy of love, her heart as overlooked as her body was mocked. When a deadly blizzard traps the villagers of Greythorne in an abandoned castle, an ancient vampire awakens from his long sleep. He demands one life in exchange for their safety. Everyone expects him to choose the young and beautiful. Instead, he points to Elsbeth. What could an immortal see in a woman the world has dismissed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The leather satchel hanging from Elsbeth's shoulder had seen more miles than most horses in Greythorne. Its worn surface, darkened by years of mountain weather and stained with the essence of countless healing herbs, told the story of a woman who had dedicated her life to mending what others had broken. At 62, Elsbeth Moorhen carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned that worth was not measured by the approval of others, though the lesson had taken decades to master. Her cottage sat at the edge of the village, close enough to answer calls for help, but far enough to spare the villagers from having to look upon her too often. The irony was not lost on her. They needed her skills, but not her presence, valued her remedies, but not her company. She had delivered their children, tended their fevers, and eased their final hours, yet still they whispered behind cupped hands when she passed. "There goes the Moorhen woman," they would say, as if her name alone carried some contagion. Strange that one so skilled with healing never could heal her own appetite. The cruelty of their words had long since lost its sting. Elsbeth had buried her husband Thomas 15 years ago, and with him any hope that love might find her again. Thomas had been different, a quiet blacksmith who saw past her substantial frame to the woman within. He had courted her with patience and married her with pride, never once making her feel anything less than treasured. When fever took him during the harsh winter of 1347, Elsbeth thought her heart might follow him to the grave. Instead, she had channeled her grief into service. If she could not save her beloved, perhaps she could save others. The great hearth in her cottage became a beacon for the suffering, its stone fireplace warming not only bodies but spirits. She learned to read the language of herbs and roots, to understand which combinations could break a fever and which could ease a difficult birth. Her hands, so often mocked for their size, proved gentle and sure when tending the wounded. The village of Greythorne itself was carved from the mountainside like a stubborn declaration against nature's harsh intentions. Stone houses huddled together against the wind, their slate roofs dark, against the perpetual grey sky that seemed to press down upon the valley. The main road wound through the centre like a scar, connecting the village to the outside world, though few travellers chose to brave the treacherous mountain passes. Mayor Aldrich ruled the village with the self-importance of a small man given limited power. His thin frame and pinched features matched his narrow worldview perfectly. He tolerated Elsbeth's presence because her skills were undeniable, but he had made it clear more than once that her appearance was an embarrassment to their community. A healer should inspire confidence, he had told her during one particularly pointed conversation. People want to believe that someone who tends to their bodies knows something about caring for their own. Elsbeth had simply nodded and continued mixing her tonics. She had learned long ago that defending herself only provided more ammunition for those determined to find fault. Mira Ashford represented everything. Elsbeth was not young, slender, blessed with the kind of ethereal beauty that made men stumble over their words. At 25, she was the mother of twin boys and wife to the village's most prosperous merchant. Yet, despite their differences, Mira had always treated Elsbeth with genuine kindness. Perhaps it was because Elsbeth had saved her life during a difficult childbirth, or perhaps Mira simply possessed the rare gift of seeing beyond surface appearances. "You saved my babies?" Mira had whispered that terrible night when the twins came too early and too small. Without you, I would have lost them both." Gareth the blacksmith, Thomas's former apprentice, had inherited more than just the forge when his master died. He had also inherited a measure of Thomas's compassion, though he expressed it more cautiously than his predecessor had. A bear of a man with arms like tree trunks, Gareth understood what it meant to be judged by appearance. His scarred hands and soot-stained skin marked him as a labourer, but his mind was sharp and his heart generous. "Thomas always said you were the finest woman in Greythorne," Gareth had told her once while she tended a burn on his forearm. "He said the rest of us were too blind to see it." The morning the blizzard began, Elsbeth was grinding willow bark for pain tonics when Mira burst through her door, her usually perfect hair wild with wind and her blue eyes wide with terror. "Elsbeth, you must come quickly," she gasped, clutching her woolen cloak against the driving snow. "Mayor Aldrich has called for everyone to gather in the Great Hall. The storm, it's unlike anything we've ever seen. The wind is strong enough to tear roofs from houses, and the snow is falling so thick you can't see your hand before your face." Through her cottage window, Elsbeth could see the truth of Mira's words. Snow fell, not in gentle flakes, but in dense curtains that seemed to swallow the landscape whole. The wind howled like something wild and hungry, rattling her shutters with a force that made her stone walls tremble. "Where does Aldrich propose we shelter?" Elsbeth asked, already reaching for her heaviest cloak. Her healing satchel was never far from her side. In a storm like this, someone would surely have need of her skills. "Castle Ravenshallow," Mira replied, and Elsbeth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Castle Ravenshallow, perched on the mountainside, above Greythorne, like a great stone beast, its towers and battlements dark against the sky, even on the clearest days. It had been abandoned for longer than anyone could remember, though stories persisted about the noble family that had once ruled from its halls. Some said they had fled during the plague years, others whispered of darker fates, mysterious disappearances, and ancient curses that had driven them from their ancestral home. "Surely there must be somewhere else," Elsbeth murmured, but even as she spoke she knew there was not. The castle's great hall was the only structure in the region, large enough to shelter the entire village, and its stone walls would provide protection against the storm's fury. The journey to the castle was a nightmare of driving snow and bitter wind. Elsbeth leaned heavily on her walking stick, her substantial frame providing welcome stability against gusts that knocked smaller villagers sideways. She stayed close to Gareth, who had appointed himself guardian of the elderly and infirm during the treacherous climb. "Strange thing," he shouted over the wind, "but the closer we get to the castle, the colder it seems to become. You'd think these old walls would provide some protection from the wind." Elsbeth nodded, though she had noticed something else entirely. The cold that seemed to emanate from the castle felt different from the natural chill of winter. It was deeper, more purposeful, as if the very stones themselves were touched by something beyond mere weather. The castle's gates stood open, their iron hinges groaning in the wind like voices crying out in pain. The courtyard beyond was shrouded in shadow despite the afternoon hour, and snow had drifted against the walls in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as if shaped by unseen hands. Inside the great hall, the villagers huddled together around a massive stone fireplace that dominated one wall. The hearth was easily large enough to roast an ox, its carved mantelpiece decorated with symbols that predated Christianity's arrival in these mountains. Someone had managed to kindle a fire, though the flames seemed reluctant to burn brightly in this place, casting more shadows than light. Elsbeth found a place near the back of the hall, understanding without being told that her presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. She arranged her cloak around her broad shoulders and settled against the cold stone wall, her healing satchel within easy reach. If this storm lasted as long as it appeared it might, there would be work for her to do. The great hall itself was a monument to forgotten grandeur. Tapestries hung in tatters from the walls, their once rich colours faded to shadows of their former glory. The vaulted ceiling disappeared into darkness above, and the sound of wind through broken windows created an eerie symphony that seemed to whisper of secrets best left undisturbed. As night fell, and the storm continued its relentless assault, the villagers tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy. They shared what food they had brought, told stories to keep the children calm, and pretended not to notice the way the temperature seemed to drop despite the fire's warmth. But Elsbeth, perhaps more sensitive than others to the subtle currents of life and death, felt something stirring beneath their feet. Deep in the foundations of Castle Ravenshollow, something ancient was beginning to wake. The first tremor was so slight that most dismissed it as the castle settling against the storm's fury. The second was stronger, causing dust to drift down from the ceiling like snow. By the third, even Mayor Aldrich's confident proclamations about their safety had given way to nervous glances toward the floor. "Perhaps it's just the wind," Mira suggested hopefully, though her grip on her sons had tightened considerably. Elsbeth said nothing, but her weathered hands moved instinctively to the worn leather of her healing satchel. In 6 decades of life, she had learned to trust her instincts, and every instinct she possessed was screaming that they were no longer alone in Castle Ravenshollow. Something was rising from the depths below, something that had slumbered here long before any of them were born. The fire in the great hearth suddenly flared higher, casting wild shadows that seemed to dance with purpose across the ancient stones. And in that moment, Elsbeth felt the weight of destiny settling upon her shoulders like a mantle she had never asked to wear. Whatever was coming, for them, she sensed with the certainty of a woman who had spent her life reading the signs of approaching change, would alter the course of her existence forever. The question was not whether she was ready at 62. She had long since learned that readiness was a luxury life rarely afforded. The question was whether she would face whatever emerged from the darkness with the same quiet dignity that had sustained her through decades of loneliness and scorn. She adjusted her grip on her walking stick and waited for the storm both outside and within these ancient walls to reveal its true nature. The fourth tremor was no mere settling of ancient stones. It rolled through the castle's foundation like the awakening breath of some colossal beast, causing the very walls to shudder and the flames in the great hearth to leap wildly skyward. Several villagers cried out in alarm, and even Mayor Aldrich's pale face had drained of what little colour it possessed. "Sweet Mary, Mother of God," whispered old Henrik, the village priest, his arthritic fingers fumbling for the wooden cross hanging around his neck. "What manner of evil stirs beneath us?" Elsbeth felt the answer in her bones before her mind could process it. The cold that had seemed unusual when they first entered the castle was intensifying, but it was not the mindless chill of winter wind. This was purposeful, intelligent, the cold of something that had been waiting in darkness for longer than memory could reach. The stone floor beneath their feet began to vibrate with a rhythm that seemed almost like a heartbeat, slow and measured, but growing stronger with each pulse. Dust cascaded from the ceiling in steady streams, and the tattered tapestries swayed as if moved by invisible hands. "We should leave," Gareth said, his deep voice cutting through the rising panic. "Storm or no storm, we should not remain here." But even as he spoke, the great wooden doors of the hall swung shut with a resounding boom that echoed through the chamber like thunder. Several men rushed to them, pulling and pushing against the heavy oak, but the doors remained sealed as if bound by more than mere iron and wood. "We're trapped," Mira whispered, gathering her twin boys closer to her breast. The temperature in the hall dropped so suddenly that their breath began to mist in the air. The fire in the hearth, which had burned strongly moments before, dimmed to barely glowing embers despite the abundance of dry wood feeding it. And then, from somewhere far below, came a sound that froze the blood in their veins, the grinding of stone against stone, as if a massive door was being slowly opened. Footsteps echoed from the depths beneath them, measured and deliberate, growing closer with each passing moment. They were the footsteps of someone who had no need to hurry, someone who knew with absolute certainty that those above had nowhere to flee. When he finally emerged from the shadowy stairwell that led to the castle's crypts, Lord Varick appeared first, as a silhouette framed in darkness, tall and imposing, moving with the fluid grace of a predator. As he stepped into the faltering light of the great hall, the villagers pressed back against the walls, as if the very stones might offer them sanctuary. He was magnificent and terrible in equal measure. Standing nearly 7 feet in height, his frame was lean but powerful, wrapped in a cloak of midnight blue that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the firelight. His face possessed the sharp, aristocratic beauty of carved marble, high cheekbones, a strong jaw, and skin so pale it seemed to glow with its own inner light. But it was his eyes that commanded attention and inspired terror. They were the color of winter storms, grey as mountain mist but shot through with silver that gleamed like starlight. Upon his right hand gleamed a signet ring of black onyx, its center dominated by a ruby the color of fresh blood. The stone seemed to pulse with its own light, keeping time with the beating of a heart that should have stopped centuries ago. "Good evening," he said, and his voice was cultured honey poured over steel. It carried the accent of old nobility, the careful pronunciation of someone educated in courts and castles when kings still ruled by divine right. "I trust you are finding my ancestral home adequately accommodating during this unfortunate weather." Mayor Aldrich stepped forward, his political instincts overriding his terror, though his voice trembled as he spoke. "My lord, we meant no trespass. The storm drove us to seek shelter, and we found the gates open." "Indeed," Lord Varick interrupted smoothly, his pale gaze sweeping across the huddled villagers like a physical touch. "The gates have been open for quite some time. I have been sleeping, you see, and in my absence, certain, shall we say, amenities have fallen into disrepair. But no matter. Your presence has awakened me at precisely the right moment." He began to move among them then, his steps silent on the stone floor despite his size. The villagers shrank away from his approach, but there was nowhere to flee. His inspection was thorough and methodical, like a connoisseur examining precious objects for purchase. "You see," he continued conversationally, his hands clasped behind his back as he walked, "immortality is rather like a disease. It requires periodic treatment to maintain one's health. I find that a feeding every few decades keeps me in optimal condition, though I confess it has been rather longer than usual since my last meal." The word fell into the silence, like a stone into still water, creating ripples of terror that spread through the assembled villagers. Several of the women began to weep silently, and the men looked desperately toward weapons they did not possess. "However," Lord Varick said, raising one pale hand to forestall the panic he could sense building, "I am not without mercy. I propose a bargain that will serve both our interests admirably." He paused before the great hearth, the dying flames casting strange shadows across his aristocratic features. When he turned to face them again, his expression was almost benevolent if one could ignore the predatory gleam in those storm-grey eyes. "One life," he said simply, "one soul, freely given in exchange for my protection of your village through the remainder of this harsh winter. The storms that rage outside are merely the beginning. I sense a brutal season ahead, one that would claim many of your number without my intervention. But with my power guarding your borders, not one additional life need be lost to cold or hunger." The bargain hung in the air like incense, sweet with promise, yet heavy with dread. The villagers looked at one another with the desperate calculation of those forced to choose between certain death and possible salvation. "Choose wisely," Lord Varick advised, his tone remaining conversational, despite the magnitude of what he proposed. "I am not an unreasonable creature, but neither am I patient beyond measure. Dawn approaches, and with it, my return to sleep with or without the sustenance I require." His gaze began to move through the crowd once more, but this time there was purpose in his inspection. The young men tried to stand taller, to project strength and defiance they did not feel. The women clutched their children closer, as if maternal love could provide protection against ancient hunger. Elsbeth watched it all with the detached clarity that comes to those who have spent a lifetime observing human nature. She saw how quickly civilized people could reduce themselves to their most basic instincts when survival was at stake. She saw Mayor Aldrich's eyes calculating which villager would be least missed. She saw beautiful Mira trying to make herself invisible while simultaneously pushing forward those she deemed less worthy, and she felt no surprise whatsoever when those storm-grey eyes finally came to rest upon her. Lord Vaerick stood motionless for a long moment, his head tilted slightly, as if listening to something only he could hear. The ruby in his signet ring pulsed brighter, and the temperature in the hall seemed to drop another degree. "Fascinating," he murmured, almost to himself. Then, in a voice that carried clearly through the silent hall, he spoke the words that would change everything. "Give me that one." His pale finger pointed directly at Elsbeth, and the reaction was immediate. Several villagers gasped in shock, others looked confused, and a few appeared almost offended on behalf of their expectations. "My lord," Mayor Aldrich stammered, "surely you cannot mean, that is to say, perhaps you would prefer—" "I mean exactly what I said," Lord Vaerick replied, his tone carrying a note of steel that silenced all protest. "That one, the woman by the wall with the healing satchel." Elsbeth felt the weight of every gaze in the hall upon her, but strangely, she felt no fear. Perhaps it was the peace that comes to those who have nothing left to lose, or perhaps it was simply that after 62 years of being overlooked and undervalued, the novelty of being chosen, even for such a purpose, held its own bitter satisfaction. She pushed herself away from the wall with her walking stick, her movements careful but dignified. Around her, the villagers parted like water before a ship's prow, their faces mixing relief at their own deliverance with shame at their willingness to sacrifice another. "I accept," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "If my life can purchase their safety, then it is a bargain fairly made." Lord Vaerick's eyebrows rose slightly, as if her calm acceptance had surprised him. He studied her face intently, and for just a moment something almost like uncertainty flickered in those storm-grey eyes. "Indeed," he said softly. "Most interesting indeed." He extended one pale hand toward her, and Elsbeth, after only the briefest hesitation, placed her weathered fingers in his. His skin was cold as winter stone but smooth as silk, and she felt the strangest sensation, as if some invisible current had passed between them at the moment of contact. "Come then," Lord Vaerick said, his voice gentler than it had been before. "We have much to discuss, you and I." As he led her toward the shadowy stairwell from which he had emerged, Elsbeth turned back once to look at the villagers she was leaving behind. Not one of them met her eyes, not even Mira, who owed her very life to Elsbeth's skill. Perhaps that, more than anything, convinced her that she had made the right choice. The descent into the castle's depths should have filled Elsbeth with dread, but instead she found herself oddly fascinated by the ancient stonework that lined the spiraling staircase. Lord Vaerick moved ahead of her with fluid grace, one pale hand trailing along the wall as, if reacquainting himself with every familiar stone, torches ignited spontaneously at their approach, casting dancing shadows that made the carved symbols on the walls seem to writhe with life. "These passages were old when my family first claimed this castle," he said without turning around, his voice echoing softly in the narrow space. "We built upon foundations laid by people whose names are lost to history, whose gods are forgotten, yet their craftsmanship endures." Elsbeth ran her own weathered fingers along the smooth stone, feeling the subtle warmth that seemed to emanate from within the walls themselves. "You speak as one who remembers those times personally." "Do I?" There was amusement in his tone. "Perhaps I have simply spent too many years in contemplation of the past. When one has little hope of a future, memory becomes one's primary companion." The staircase opened into a circular chamber that took Elsbeth's breath away. The room was elegant beyond anything she had ever imagined, furnished with pieces that spoke of centuries of refined taste. Rich tapestries covered the walls. These, unlike the ruins above, were perfectly preserved, their colors as vibrant as the day they were woven. A fire burned cheerfully in a smaller but no less ornate hearth, its warmth immediately banishing the chill that had followed them down the stairs. Near a tall window draped in midnight blue velvet sat a small table set with an intricate chess set. The pieces were carved from obsidian and ivory, each figure a work of art in miniature. The board itself was inlaid with silver and seemed to catch and hold the firelight in its polished surface. "Please," Lord Varick said, gesturing toward a chair upholstered in deep burgundy velvet. "Sit. You must be weary from your journey, and I confess I am curious to understand why you accepted your fate so readily." Elsbeth settled into the chair, surprised by its comfort. She had expected a dungeon, perhaps chains and cold stone. Instead, she found herself in what could only be described as a gentleman's private study, elegant and welcoming despite its owner's supernatural nature. "You expected tears and pleading," she observed, adjusting her healing satchel so it rested comfortably beside her chair. "I'm afraid I must disappoint you. At my age, one learns that fighting the inevitable only prolongs suffering." Lord Varick moved to a sideboard and poured wine from a crystal decanter into 2 goblets. The vintage was deep red, almost black in the firelight, and when he offered her one, Elsbeth noted that his hand was perfectly steady. "I expected terror," he corrected, settling into the chair opposite hers. "Most mortals, faced with their mortality, react predictably. You, however, walk down here as calmly as if accepting an invitation to tea." Elsbeth sipped the wine and found it exquisite, with a complexity that spoke of centuries in careful storage. "Perhaps because I recognized something in your eyes that the others did not see." "And what might that be?" "Loneliness," she said simply. "The kind that comes not from being alone, but from being surrounded by those who cannot understand you." For a moment, Lord Varick's composed expression flickered, revealing something raw beneath the aristocratic mask. He set down his goblet with deliberate care and studied her face as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "You are not what I expected when I chose you." "What did you expect?" "Fear. Submission. The mindless terror that has been my companion for so many centuries that I had forgotten any other response was possible." He leaned back in his chair, his storm-grey eyes thoughtful. "Instead, I find myself sitting across from a woman who appears utterly unafraid of a creature that should inspire nothing but dread." Elsbeth considered this as she took another sip of wine. "Tell me, my lord, when did you last engage in simple conversation with another person? Not commands or threats, but genuine discourse between equals?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. His pale fingers drummed silently against the arm of his chair, and she could see him searching his memory for an answer that clearly disturbed him. "I cannot remember," he admitted finally. "Decades, certainly, perhaps longer." "Then perhaps you chose me not for my blood, but for my company." The suggestion hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to find. Lord Varick rose from his chair and moved to the chess set, his long fingers trailing over the obsidian pieces with something approaching reverence. "Do you play?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. "My late husband taught me. I'm afraid I lack the strategic mind for true mastery, but I find the game contemplative." "Then perhaps you would indulge me." He began arranging the pieces with practiced efficiency. "It has been far too long since I had a worthy opponent." As they settled into the game, Elsbeth found herself genuinely intrigued by her captor. His moves were elegant and precise, but she detected something unexpected in his strategy restraint. He was clearly capable of devastating attacks, yet he seemed more interested in extending the game than ending it quickly. "You're holding back," she observed after her fifth move. "Am I? A man who has had centuries to perfect his chess would not make such generous choices unless he had reasons beyond winning." Lord Varick captured one of her pawns with his knight, but his expression was thoughtful rather than triumphant. "Perhaps I am simply out of practice, or perhaps you are enjoying the conversation more than the competition." Their eyes met across the board, and Elsbeth saw something shift in his expression. The predatory gleam that had marked his interaction with the villagers was replaced by something far more complex: curiosity mixed with what might have been gratitude. "When I chose you," he said quietly, "I sensed something different. Your soul has a quality that called to me. I expected to find fear hiding beneath that calm exterior. Instead, I find wisdom, acceptance, and a strength that puts my own centuries of existence to shame." Elsbeth moved her bishop, putting his king in check. "Perhaps what you sensed was simply the peace that comes to those who have stopped fighting themselves." He studied the board for a long moment before making his defensive move. "What do you mean by that?" "I spent the first 40 years of my life wishing I was someone else, smaller, prettier, more acceptable to the world around me. It was only after Thomas died that I realized how much energy I had wasted on that futile struggle. The last 20 years have been far more peaceful because I finally learned to be content with who I am." Lord Varick leaned back in his chair, his wine forgotten. "And who are you, Elsbeth of Greythorne?" She considered the question seriously, studying his face in the firelight. Despite his supernatural nature, despite the circumstances that had brought them together, she found herself responding with complete honesty. "I am a woman who has loved deeply and lost greatly. I am a healer who has dedicated her life to easing the suffering of others, even when they showed me no kindness in return. I am someone who has learned that true worth comes not from the opinions of others, but from the choices we make when no one is watching." The game continued in comfortable silence for several more moves, but Elsbeth could feel something fundamental shifting between them. When Lord Varick finally looked up from the board, his expression held a vulnerability she had not expected to see. "Would you find it strange if I confessed that I have not felt this comfortable in the presence of another being for longer than I care to calculate?" "Not strange at all," Elsbeth replied gently. "Loneliness recognizes loneliness, regardless of the form it takes." 3 days passed in the underground chamber, though Elsbeth had to rely on Lord Varick's word for the passage of time, since no natural light reached their sanctuary. The storm above continued to rage with supernatural fury, but in the warmth of his private quarters she found herself settling into an unexpected routine that bore no resemblance to captivity. Each morning, if morning it could be called in this timeless place, she woke in a bed more comfortable than any she had ever known, dressed in garments of fine wool and silk that had been provided for her comfort. Lord Varick, it seemed, required little sleep but much solitude for contemplation. She often found him standing by the draped window, though what he could see through the heavy fabric remained a mystery. "You're thinking of them," she observed on the third day, settling into her customary chair with a cup of tea that had appeared, like so many other comforts, without explanation of its origin. "The villagers," he turned from the window, his pale features thoughtful. "In a manner of speaking, I find myself curious about your life among them. You speak of healing, of service, yet they showed you no loyalty when the moment of choice arrived." Elsbeth reached into her healing satchel and withdrew a small silver locket, its surface worn smooth by decades of handling. She opened it carefully, revealing a tiny painted portrait of a man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "This is Thomas," she said, offering the locket for his inspection. "My husband. He was the only person in Greythorne who ever saw me as beautiful." Lord Varick accepted the delicate piece with surprising gentleness, his long fingers handling it as if it were made of spun glass. He studied the portrait for a long moment, and when he looked up, his expression held a sadness she had not seen before. "He loved you, truly," he said, and it was not a question. "For 15 years, I knew what it was to be cherished, to be seen not as a burden or an embarrassment, but as a treasure worth protecting." She accepted the locket back and closed it carefully, her thumb tracing the familiar pattern of its silver surface. "When he died, I thought that part of my life was over forever." Thought? The question was asked so quietly she almost missed it. When she looked up, she found Lord Varick watching her with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable, but somehow was not. "I no longer know what to think," she admitted. "These past few days have been unexpected." Indeed, they had been far more than that. Each day brought new discoveries about her mysterious captor. She had learned that he possessed a library that would rival any cathedral's collection, filled with volumes in languages both familiar and utterly foreign. She had discovered that his knowledge of healing herbs exceeded even her own, accumulated through centuries of necessity and study. Most surprising of all, she had found that conversation with Lord Varick was the most intellectually stimulating experience of her adult life. He spoke of history as one who had witnessed it, of philosophy with the depth of someone who had wrestled with questions of existence for far longer than any mortal mind could comprehend. "Tell me about your transformation," she said, pouring herself more tea. "How does one become what you are?" He was quiet for so long that she wondered if she had overstepped some invisible boundary. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries. "Love," he said simply. "Love and betrayal, and a choice made in desperation that I have regretted every day since." He moved to the fireplace, resting one pale hand against the stone mantelpiece. In the dancing light, his aristocratic features seemed carved from marble, beautiful and eternally cold. "I was mortal once, the youngest son of a noble house. While my brothers fought wars and managed lands, I studied medicine and philosophy. I believed that knowledge could cure any ill, solve any problem." His laugh was bitter as winter wind. Such arrogance in one so young. "What changed? I fell in love with a woman I could not have. She was promised to another, a marriage of political alliance that would unite two great houses. I thought my feelings were returned, but when the moment came to choose between love and duty, she chose differently." Elsbeth set down her teacup with careful precision. "She broke your heart. She destroyed my world. But that alone would not have led me to this existence. No, it was what came after the plague that swept through our lands, claiming thousands. I threw myself into finding a cure, working day and night until exhaustion became my only companion." He turned back to face her, his storm-grey eyes distant with memory. "There are forces in this world older than Christianity, older than Rome. In my desperation, I sought them out. I made bargains with beings that should never be bargained with, traded my mortality for the power to save lives. And did you? Save them?" "Oh yes. I saved everyone in my lands, but at a cost I had not anticipated. The cure required blood, you see, my blood freely given. But once I had tasted death and been reborn, I found that the hunger it brought was insatiable." Elsbeth absorbed this revelation in thoughtful silence. She had seen enough of life to know that good intentions often led to terrible consequences, that the road to damnation was indeed paved with noble purposes. "How many?" she asked quietly. "In the early years? Too many. I was young in my new existence, driven by hungers I did not understand. But eventually, I learned control. These past few centuries, I have fed only when absolutely necessary and never taken a life that would be mourned. Until now." He stiffened at her words, but she continued before he could respond. Yet here I sit, 3 days later, very much alive and quite comfortable. Either your hunger is less pressing than you claimed, or you chose me for reasons you have not yet acknowledged to yourself. The suggestion hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Lord Varick moved to the chessboard, his fingers trailing over the pieces they had abandoned mid-game the night before. You think me incapable of such deception. I think you incapable of lying to yourself about what you truly need. Loneliness is a hunger too, my lord, and perhaps a more pressing one than you realized. He was quiet for a long time, his pale fingers absently rearranging the chess pieces into new configurations. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. In 7 centuries of existence, I have never met anyone who saw past the monster to find the man beneath. Yet you sit here calmly, drinking tea and offering insights that cut to the very heart of truths I have spent decades avoiding. Perhaps that is why you chose me, not for my blood, but for my ability to see you clearly. And what do you see, Elsbeth? She rose from her chair and moved to stand beside him at the chessboard. In the firelight, his pale skin seemed to glow with inner radiance, and she found herself reaching out to touch the back of his hand without conscious thought. I see a man who has been alone for far too long, carrying burdens that were never meant to be borne in solitude. I see someone who has forgotten that he deserves compassion, even from himself. At her touch, he went perfectly still, as if her weathered fingers were made of flame rather than flesh. When he looked down at her, his expression held such vulnerability that she felt her heart constrict with unexpected tenderness. "How do you do that?" he whispered. "Do what?" "Make me remember what it felt like to be human." On the 4th evening, Lord Varick led Elsbeth through a doorway she had not previously noticed, concealed behind a tapestry depicting a medieval hunt. The passage beyond was narrower than the others, carved from living rock and lit by the same mysterious torches that seemed to ignite at their approach. "There is something I wish to show you," he said, his voice carrying an undertone of uncertainty that surprised her. "Something that may help you understand why your presence here has affected me so profoundly." The passage opened into a circular chamber unlike any other in the castle. The walls were lined with mirrors of every conceivable size and shape, some framed in gold, others in silver, still others in materials she could not identify. But it was the mirror at the chamber's center that commanded attention. It stood nearly 7 feet in height, its frame carved from what appeared to be moonstone that caught and held the torchlight like captured starlight. The surface within was not the familiar silver of ordinary mirrors, but something deeper, a reflective depth that seemed to invite the viewer to step through into whatever lay beyond. "The moonstone mirror," Lord Varick said, his tone carrying the reverence of one speaking of something sacred. "It has been in my family for more than 1,000 years, though we were never its true masters. We were merely its guardians." Elsbeth approached it slowly, drawn by an inexplicable fascination. As she moved closer, she could feel something almost like warmth emanating from its surface, as if the mirror itself were alive. "What does it do?" "It shows truth rather than mere appearance. Most people see only what they expect to see when they look at their reflection, their flaws magnified, their insecurities confirmed. This mirror strips away such deceptions. It reveals what actually exists beneath the surface of things." "And you want me to look into it?" He nodded, though she could see tension in the set of his shoulders. "I confess I am curious about what it will reveal about you. In 7 centuries, I have never met anyone whose surface appearance seemed so at odds with their inner nature." Elsbeth studied his face in the mirror's strange light. "You've looked into it yourself." It was not a question, and he did not treat it as one. "Many times, though never with pleasure. What I see there—" He paused, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "What I see confirms every dark truth about my nature. The monster I became, the lives I've taken, the humanity I sacrificed for power. It shows me exactly what I am. And what is that? A creature of shadows and blood, beautiful on the surface, but rotted at the core. A predator wearing the mask of nobility. Elsbeth turned to face him fully, studying his aristocratic features in the torchlight. When she spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. That is what guilt sees when it looks for confirmation of its judgment. But guilt is not the same as truth. Before he could respond, she turned back to the mirror and stepped directly in front of its moonstone frame. For a moment, the surface remained dark, as if the depths were deciding whether to accept her gaze. Then, gradually, an image began to form. What Elsbeth saw took her breath away. The woman looking back at her was herself, but transformed not in body, for her substantial frame remained unchanged, but in presence. The figure in the mirror stood tall and proud, her grey hair flowing like silver water around shoulders held straight with confidence. Her face, lined with decades of care and sorrow, glowed with an inner light that spoke of wisdom hard-won and compassion freely given. But it was her hands that drew Elsbeth's attention most powerfully. In the mirror's reflection, they were not the weathered, practical hands of a village healer, but something far more magnificent. They seemed to glow with gentle radiance, and she could see in them the echo of every life they had touched, every pain they had eased, every birth they had guided safely into the world. "Beautiful," she whispered, hardly believing what she was seeing. Lord Varick moved to stand beside her, his storm-grey eyes fixed on her reflection with an expression of wonder. "Now you begin to understand what I saw the moment I chose you from among the villagers. This is how you see me. This is how you actually are. The mirror cannot lie, Elsbeth. What you see there is your true nature, stripped of the cruel judgments others have layered upon you over the years." She turned slightly, studying her profile in the enchanted glass. The woman reflected there possessed a dignity and strength that took her breath away, not despite her size, but encompassing it entirely. She was substantial in every sense of the word, a force of nature contained in mortal form. "I spent so many years believing their whispers," she murmured, "thinking that my worth was somehow less because my body did not conform to their expectations. And now?" She looked at him through the mirror's surface, seeing how his pale features were reflected alongside her own. In that strange light, they appeared perfectly matched two beings who had been overlooked and underestimated by the world, yet who possessed depths that few could fathom. "Now I begin to understand why you chose me," she said quietly. "You saw past the surface to something that even I had forgotten existed." Lord Varick's reflection moved closer to hers, and she could see the vulnerability in his expression, the way his centuries of isolation had left him hungry for connection with someone who could truly see him in return. "Look now," he said softly. "Look at both our reflections together." She did, and gasped at what the mirror revealed. Side by side, they were magnificent, not the monster and the outcast that the world saw, but two souls recognizing their perfect complement in each other. His pale, ethereal beauty balanced her earthbound strength. His supernatural grace found its match in her mortal wisdom. Where he was sharp angles and winter storms, she was gentle, curves, and healing warmth. "We are not so different," she observed, her voice filled with wonder. "No," he agreed, his tone carrying a hope she had not heard before. "We are not. Both of us have been judged by surfaces rather than substance. Both of us have been found wanting by standards that were never meant to measure our true worth." In the mirror's depths, their hands moved closer together, and Elsbeth felt her breath catch as his fingers intertwined with hers. The reflection showed their joined hands, surrounded by a soft, golden light, as if their connection had awakened something powerful within the mirror itself. "Is it possible," she whispered, "for two such damaged souls to find healing in each other?" His reflection smiled, and it was the first time she had seen genuine joy in his expression. "With you," he said quietly, "I begin to believe that anything is possible." The mirror's surface rippled like water disturbed by a gentle breeze, and for a moment their reflections seemed to lean toward each other with an inevitability that spoke of destiny rather than mere chance. When the surface cleared again, both of them were looking directly at each other rather than at their reflections. "Elsbeth," Lord Varick said, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. "Varick," she replied, using his given name for the first time since they had met. The distance between them seemed to shrink without either of them taking a step, and she found herself looking up into storm-grey eyes that held centuries of loneliness finally beginning to hope for an end. The intimacy of their moment before the moonstone mirror lingered between them as they returned to Varick's private chambers. Elsbeth found herself acutely aware of every detail of his presence, the whisper of his cloak against the stone floor, the graceful economy of his movements, the way torchlight caught the silver threads in his dark hair. Something fundamental had shifted in their relationship, and they both seemed to be carefully navigating this new territory. Varick moved to a cabinet she had not noticed before, its dark wood carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift in the firelight. From within, he withdrew a small wooden box bound with faded ribbon silk that had once been blue but had aged to the color of twilight. "There is something else I would share with you," he said, his voice carrying a hesitancy that spoke of vulnerability. "Something that may help you understand the man I was before I became this." He settled into the chair across from her, the box resting carefully in his pale hands. For a long moment, he simply stared at it, as if gathering courage for what he was about to reveal. "Her name was Isabel," he said finally. "Lady Isabel de Montclair, daughter of a duke, promised from birth to strengthen political alliances through marriage. I met her when I was 26, already older than most men when they take wives, but I had been too absorbed in my studies to pay court to anyone." His long fingers traced the faded ribbon with gentle reverence. "She came to our castle for a summer visit, part of the endless social dance that occupied the nobility of those times. I was meant to be her escort during her stay, to show her our libraries and gardens, while the adults negotiated the terms of her betrothal to another. But you fell in love, completely, utterly, with a devotion that transformed everything I thought I knew about myself." He untied the ribbon with careful precision, revealing a collection of letters written in faded ink on parchment that had yellowed with age. She was radiant. Not merely beautiful, though she was that, but alive in a way that made everyone around her seem dim by comparison. He selected one of the letters and unfolded it with the care of someone handling holy relics. She could discuss philosophy with the depth of a scholar, yet laugh at simple pleasures with the joy of PTO, a child. She saw beauty in everything, in the way morning light fell across ancient stones, in the face of a peasant woman selling flowers at market, in the awkward earnestness of a younger son who had spent too many years with books instead of people. She saw the beauty in you. So I believed. For 3 months, we walked together through gardens and galleries, sharing thoughts I had never spoken aloud to anyone. She listened to my theories about medicine and healing with genuine interest. She challenged my ideas about philosophy and religion with arguments so elegant they took my breath away. He handed her the letter, and Elsbeth read the faded words with growing amazement. The handwriting was feminine but strong, the language cultured yet warm. But it was the content that made her heart ache, expressions of affection so tender and genuine that they seemed to glow with their own light. "My dearest Varick," the letter began, "your discourse this afternoon on the nature of compassion has stayed with me through the evening hours. How blessed I am to have found someone who understands that true strength lies not in domination, but in the gentle power of healing. She loved you," Elsbeth said softly, looking up from the parchment. These are not the words of someone merely passing time with pleasant conversation. Verik's expression was filled with a pain so profound it made her chest tighten with sympathy. That is what I believed, what I hoped. We spoke of a future together quietly, carefully, knowing that such things were rarely decided by the hearts of those involved. But she gave me reason to hope that she might convince her father to consider a different arrangement. He selected another letter, this one longer and more passionate. As Elsbeth read, she felt tears prick at her eyes. The woman who had written these words clearly adored Verik with a depth that matched his own feelings. She wrote of their conversations, their shared laughter, their quiet moments of understanding that needed no words. What happened? Reality intruded, as it always does. Her father arrived to escort her home and finalize the details of her betrothal. I went to her chambers that final night, determined to declare myself formally and ask her to choose love over duty. His voice became so quiet, she had to lean forward to hear him. I found her packing in tears, but when I offered to take her away, to marry her regardless of her father's wishes, she told me our summer had been nothing more than a pleasant diversion, that she had never intended for me to develop such serious feelings. She was lying. Perhaps. Or perhaps she simply lacked the courage to defy convention. It matters little now, the result was the same. She married her duke 3 months later, and I threw myself into my medical studies with a passion that bordered on madness. When the plague came to our lands 2 years later, I saw it as divine judgment for my presumption in thinking I could claim such happiness. Elsbeth looked down at the letters again, seeing in their passionate words a love story that should have had a different ending. These letters tell a different truth than her final words to you. Do they? He gathered the letters carefully, refolding each one with practiced precision. Sometimes I think I saved them to torture myself with what might have been. Other times I wonder if they represent the only real joy I ever knew in my mortal existence. Or perhaps, Elsbeth said gently, they represent proof that you are capable of inspiring deep and lasting love in someone who truly knows you. The suggestion seemed to catch him off guard. He looked up at her with an expression of surprise, as if the possibility had never occurred to him. You think she loved me truly, even though she chose duty over her heart? I think she loved you desperately, and that choosing duty over love broke her heart as surely as it broke yours. Sometimes the greatest tragedy is not unrequited love, but love that is mutual yet impossible. Verik was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire with eyes that held centuries of regret. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. If that is true, then perhaps I have been carrying the wrong guilt all these years. Perhaps I should have mourned not the failure of love, but the cruel circumstances that made such love impossible. And perhaps, Elsbeth said softly, you might consider that love, true love, can find you more than once in a lifetime, even one as long as yours. Their eyes met across the space between their chairs, and in his storm-grey gaze she saw the first tentative stirring of hope, not just for companionship or comfort, but for something deeper and more transformative. Elsbeth, he said, and her name carried the weight of possibility. She set her teacup aside and moved to kneel beside his chair, her weathered hands covering his pale ones. I cannot promise to heal all your old wounds, Verik, but I can promise to see you clearly, not as the monster you believe yourself to be, but as the man who has loved deeply and lost greatly, who has made mistakes but never stopped seeking redemption. His free hand moved to touch her face with butterfly gentleness, his thumb tracing the line of her cheek as if she were made of the most precious porcelain. And I can promise, he said, his voice rough with emotion, to see you as you truly are, not as the world has judged you, but as the magnificent woman who has somehow managed to awaken feelings I thought had died centuries ago. The distance between them seemed to disappear entirely, and when his lips finally met hers, it was with a tenderness that spoke of reverence rather than mere passion, two wounded souls, recognizing in each other the possibility of healing they had never dared to hope they might find. The revelation came on the seventh day, as Elsbeth was tending to. A small cut on Verrick's hand, a minor injury sustained while handling one of his ancient books whose binding had grown sharp with age. She had insisted on cleaning and dressing the wound despite his protests that such attention was unnecessary for one of his supernatural constitution. "You fuss over me as if I were mortal," he said, watching with fascination as her gentle fingers worked their familiar magic. "Perhaps because I see the man beneath the immortal," she replied, wrapping the clean cloth around his palm with practiced efficiency. "Besides, even supernatural beings deserve care and tenderness." It was as her skin made contact with his that she felt it, a sudden surge of warmth that seemed to flow between them like electricity. But more than that, she felt something else entirely, a recognition, as if some long dormant part of her soul had suddenly awakened and was calling out to something in him. Verrick went perfectly still, his storm-grey eyes widening with shock. "Impossible," he whispered. "What is it?" Elsbeth asked, though she could feel her own pulse racing in response to whatever had just passed between them. Instead of answering, he rose abruptly and moved to another concealed cabinet, this one hidden behind a section of stone that looked identical to every other part of the wall. His hands moved over the surface in a complex pattern, and she heard the soft click of hidden mechanisms before the stone swung inward. From within the secret compartment, he withdrew an object that made Elsbeth's breath catch in her throat. It was a dagger, but unlike any blade she had ever seen. The handle was carved from what appeared to be crystallized moonlight, while the blade itself seemed to be forged from starfire. It gleamed with an inner radiance that had nothing to do with reflected light. "The Covenant blade," Verrick said, his voice filled with awe and something that might have been fear. "I had hoped that I would never have reason to bring it forth again." "What is it?" "A relic from the time before time, when the boundaries between mortal and immortal were less fixed than they are now. Legend says it was forged by the first vampires, those who chose their transformation not from desperation or accident, but from love." He held the blade carefully, reverently, as if it were a living thing capable of independent action. In the firelight, the crystalline handle seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. "I do not understand." Verrick turned to face her, his expression a mixture of wonder and trepidation. "When you touched me just now, when our blood mingled through the wound on my hand, I felt something I have not experienced in 7 centuries. The blade responded to that connection. It sang with recognition. Sang. The Covenant blade only awakens in the presence of true mates, two souls so perfectly matched that they can transcend the boundaries of mortality together. It was created to offer a choice that most vampires never have, the opportunity to share immortality with one's perfect complement." Elsbeth sank slowly into her chair, her mind reeling with the implications of his words. I mean that what happened between us was not chance, Elsbeth. I did not choose you randomly from among the villagers. Something deeper drew me to you, something I did not fully understand until this moment." He knelt before her chair, the glowing blade resting across his palms like an offering. "I sensed it the moment I saw you, a resonance in your soul that called to mine. Your supernatural heritage, dormant until now, recognized what I was and sang out to me across the crowded hall." "Supernatural heritage?" The words felt foreign on her tongue. "Your healing abilities are not merely the result of study and practice, though you have certainly honed them through dedication. They stem from bloodlines that trace back to the earliest days of this world, when healers possessed powers that went far beyond herb lore and setting bones." Elsbeth thought of all the times her patients had recovered from ailments that should have claimed their lives, of the way her hands seemed to know instinctively where to apply pressure to stop bleeding or how to ease pain with the lightest touch. "The woman who trained me, old Meredith, she said I had a gift. She said Some people were born with hands that could call life back from the edge of darkness, because you were. Your grandmother and her grandmother before her carried the blood of the original healers women who served as bridges between the world of the living and the realm of spirits. It is why you felt no fear when faced with my supernatural nature. Part of you recognized what I was, because part of you belongs to the same ancient world. The revelation reframed everything she had thought she knew about herself, the way animals had always trusted her instinctively. The dreams she sometimes had of places and people she had never seen, the certainty she felt when working with herbs, as if the plants themselves were whispering their secrets to her. And this blade, what does it do? Varric's expression grew solemn. It offers transformation without the usual violence and horror that marks most vampire creation. When used in the proper ritual, with the consent of both parties, it can grant immortality while preserving the soul intact. The person who undergoes this transformation retains their essential nature while gaining supernatural abilities and eternal life. You want to make me like you. I want to offer you the choice, he corrected gently. Nothing would be forced upon you. But if you were willing, if you chose to accept the transformation, we could have eternity together. Not as predator and prey, not as master and servant, but as true partners in every sense. The magnitude of what he was proposing crashed over her like a wave. Immortality, eternal life spent with this magnificent, complex man who had somehow seen past all her defenses to the woman she had never dared believe herself capable of being. How long have you known this was possible? I suspected from the moment I chose you, but I was not certain until our blood mingled. The Covenant Blade's awakening confirms what I had barely dared to hope, that you are my mate in the truest sense. The one soul in all the world perfectly suited to complement my own. Elsbeth reached out tentatively to touch the blade's crystalline handle. The moment her fingers made contact, she felt a surge of warmth that seemed to fill her entire being. Images flashed through her mind, visions of herself and Varric standing together through centuries, their love growing deeper and stronger with each passing year. She saw herself as she could become, still recognizably herself, but enhanced, powerful, eternal. The choice must be freely made, Varric said urgently. I will not press you for an answer now, or ever, but I needed you to understand what lies between us, why our connection feels so profound and immediate. And if I choose mortality, if I prefer to live out my natural span of years. Pain flashed across his aristocratic features, but his voice remained steady. Then I would treasure whatever time we have together and ensure that you live those years in comfort and happiness. Your choice would be honored absolutely. Elsbeth withdrew her hand from the blade, though the warmth of its touch continued to pulse through her veins. She looked up into Varric's storm-grey eyes and saw centuries of loneliness finally balanced against the possibility of eternal companionship. This explains why the villagers' judgment never truly wounded me, she mused. Some part of me always knew I was meant for something different, something larger than their small understanding could encompass. You were meant for this, he agreed softly. Meant for us. The question is whether you want what fate has offered. The Covenant blade pulsed brighter in his hands, as if responding to the depth of emotion flowing between them. Outside, the supernatural storm that had raged for 7 days was finally beginning to calm, but neither of them noticed. They were too absorbed in contemplating a future that stretched beyond the boundaries of mortal existence, a love that could literally last forever. I need time to think, Elsbeth said finally. Of course. This is not a decision to be made lightly. But even as she spoke the words, she could feel something deep within her soul, already turning toward the choice that would bind them together for eternity. The question was not whether she wanted immortality, it was whether she had the courage to claim the love that had found her at last. The kiss lingered between them like a promise newly made, tender and full of possibility. But as they drew apart, Elsbeth noticed something that made her breath catch. Varric's storm-grey eyes held not just affection, but a weight of knowledge that spoke of secrets yet unrevealed. "There is more you haven't told me," she said, not accusingly, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had learned to read the subtle signs of withheld truth. "About why you chose me, about what this truly means." Varric's expression shifted, vulnerability giving way to something more complex, anticipation mixed with what might have been fear. He rose from his chair and moved to a section of the wall that appeared identical to all the others, running his pale fingers along the stone until he found some invisible trigger. A panel slid aside, revealing a hidden alcove within which rested a single object. The dagger was magnificent and terrible in equal measure. Its blade was forged from what appeared to be silver, but silver that held an inner light like captured moonbeams. The hilt was wrapped in midnight blue leather, and set into the pommel was a gem that defied easy description. It seemed to shift between deep purple and blood red depending on the angle of view, pulsing with a rhythm that matched the beating of a heart. "The Covenant blade," Varric said, his voice carrying the reverence of one speaking of something sacred and dangerous in equal measure. "Forged in the earliest days of my family's line by powers that predate human civilization. It is both blessing and curse, salvation and damnation." Elsbeth studied the weapon with the careful attention of someone who had learned that the most beautiful things were often the most perilous. "What does it do?" "It grants immortality to mortals, but only to those whose souls are pure enough to survive the transformation without losing their essential humanity. The process is both physical and spiritual, remaking the very essence of what someone is while preserving who they are." The implications of his words struck her like a physical blow. She moved closer to the alcove, drawn by a compulsion she didn't fully understand. As she approached, the gem in the hilt pulsed brighter, its rhythm synchronizing with her own heartbeat. "You didn't choose me for my blood," she said, understanding flooding through her like dawn breaking over mountains. "You chose me as a candidate for this transformation. I chose you because, from the moment I saw you, I could sense something that has eluded me for 7 centuries, a soul pure enough to survive what the blade offers, yet strong enough to embrace what immortality truly means." Varric's confession hung in the air between them, reshaping everything she thought she knew about their situation. The revelation should have terrified her, but instead she felt a strange sense of completion, as if pieces of a puzzle were finally falling into place. "How long have you been searching?" "Centuries. The loneliness of immortal existence becomes unbearable after the first few hundred years. I have sought someone worthy of this gift, someone who could share eternity without losing themselves to the darkness that immortality can bring." She turned to face him, studying his aristocratic features in the blade's strange light. "And you believe I am such a person?" "I know you are. Your reaction to learning what I am, your acceptance of circumstances that would drive most people mad with terror, the way you see past surfaces to essential truths. These are not common qualities, Elsbeth. They speak of a soul that has been tested by life and refined rather than broken." The Covenant blade seemed to call to her, its light growing stronger as she stood before it. Without conscious thought, she reached toward it, stopping just short of touching the hilt. "There's something else," Varric continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Something about you that I sensed but couldn't quite identify until I saw your reflection in the moonstone mirror." "What do you mean?" "Your healing abilities, the way people have always found you. Different, set apart. These are not merely the talents of a skilled herbalist. You carry supernatural blood in your veins, Elsbeth. Distant, diluted perhaps, but present nonetheless. The revelation hit her like a thunderbolt. Suddenly, a lifetime of feeling different, of being able to sense things others couldn't, of having an almost supernatural understanding of how to heal both body and spirit, began to make sense. That's impossible. My family, we're common folk, healers and herbalists, going back generations, but nothing more. Magic recognizes magic, no matter how faint. Your abilities go far beyond mere knowledge of plants and remedies. You can sense the life force in others, understand instinctively what they need for healing. These are gifts of the blood, not skills that can simply be learned. Elsbeth sank into the nearest chair, her mind reeling with the implications. Everything about her life, her isolation from others, her uncanny ability to heal the way she had, never quite fit into the normal patterns of village existence, suddenly took on new meaning. How long have you known? I suspected from the moment I chose you, but I was certain when I saw how the moonstone mirror responded to your presence. It only reveals truth to those who possess some degree of supernatural heritage. She looked up at him, seeing him clearly, for perhaps the first time since they had met. This was all planned, wasn't it? The storm, finding me among the villagers, the bargain you struck, none of it was coincidence. The storm was my doing, yes. I had sensed your presence in the village below and needed to create circumstances that would bring you to the castle. As for the bargain, he moved to kneel beside her chair, his pale hands covering hers with gentle warmth. I could not simply take you against your will. The transformation must be freely chosen, or it will fail. Everything I did was designed to give you the opportunity to see me as something other than a monster, to understand that what I offer is not death, but a different kind of life. Eternal life, with you, if you choose it. The blade can grant you immortality, but it cannot force you to love. That must come naturally, freely, or it means nothing. Elsbeth was quiet for a long time, absorbing everything he had told her. The revelation should have felt like betrayal, but instead it felt like destiny finally revealing its hand. She thought of her life in Greythorne, the loneliness, the isolation, the sense of never quite belonging anywhere or to anyone. What would it mean, she asked finally, if I chose this transformation? You would become like me, immortal, possessed of supernatural strength and abilities, but retaining your essential self. Your healing gifts would be magnified 1,000-fold. You could ease suffering in ways you've never imagined, help people across centuries rather than decades. And the cost? You would leave your mortal life behind forever. There could be no return to Greythorne, no resumption of your former existence. You would walk between worlds, belonging fully to neither mortal nor supernatural realms. She rose from her chair and moved back to the alcove where the Covenant blade waited. This close, she could feel its power like a physical force, calling to something deep within her that she was only beginning to understand. The villagers, she said quietly. They showed me no loyalty when the moment of choice arrived. They were willing to sacrifice me to save themselves. Why should I mourn leaving such a life behind? And yet you hesitate. She turned to look at him, this magnificent and tragic creature who had orchestrated everything to bring them to this moment. Not because I fear the transformation, or because I doubt what you're offering me. I hesitate because I want to be certain that what grows between us is real, not simply the result of careful manipulation designed to achieve your goals. Varick's expression filled with such pain that she immediately regretted her words. But before she could apologize, he spoke with a voice raw with honesty. If all I wanted was a companion bound to me by gratitude and circumstance, I could have chosen any of a dozen more conventional beauties over the centuries. What I feel for you, what has grown between us these past few days, that was never part of my plan. That was destiny working its will despite my careful schemes. He moved to stand before her, his hands cupping her face with infinite tenderness. "I love you, Elsbeth, not because you might choose immortality, not because you carry supernatural blood, but because you are the finest person I have met in 7 centuries of existence. If you choose mortality and a return to your former life, I will grieve, but I will understand. The choice must be yours alone." Looking into his storm-grey eyes, seeing the vulnerability and genuine affection there, Elsbeth felt the last of her doubts melt away. Whatever had brought them together, destiny, manipulation, or mere chance, what existed between them now was real and precious beyond measure. "Then I choose," she said quietly, reaching for the covenant blade with steady hands. "I choose love. I choose eternity. I choose you." The night that followed the revelation of the covenant blade was the longest of Elsbeth's mortal existence. Sleep eluded her entirely as she lay in the luxurious bed Veyric had provided, staring up at the stone ceiling while her mind wrestled with the most momentous decision any soul could face. Through the heavy curtains, she could hear the supernatural storm finally beginning to abate, its fury spent after 7 days of unnatural rage. Veyric, with characteristic sensitivity, had withdrawn to give her space for contemplation, but she could feel his presence somewhere in the depths of the castle, as if the connection between them had grown so strong that physical distance could not diminish it. The very air seemed to hum with anticipation, as if the ancient stones themselves were holding their breath, waiting for her choice. She rose before dawn, or what she imagined dawn might be in the world above, and found herself drawn to the chamber that housed the moonstone mirror. The artifact seemed to sense her approach, its crystalline surface beginning to glow with soft radiance as she entered the room. "Show me," she whispered to her reflection. "Show me the truth of what I might become." The mirror's surface shimmered and reformed, and suddenly she was looking not at her current self, but at a vision of possibility. The woman in the reflection possessed the same substantial frame, the same weathered hands, the same lines of care and wisdom around her eyes. But she was transformed, radiant with supernatural power, her grey hair gleaming like silver moonlight, her healing abilities enhanced beyond anything mortal skill could achieve. Beside her, reflected form, appeared Veyric, and together they were magnificent. Not the monster and the outcast that the world had labelled them, but 2 immortal beings perfectly matched in power and purpose. She saw them working together through the centuries, her healing abilities guided by his accumulated wisdom, his lonely existence warmed by her generous heart. "The choice torments you." She turned to find Veyric, standing in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral, though she could see the tension in his shoulders. He was dressed simply in dark clothing that emphasized his pale beauty, and she realized with a start that he appeared younger somehow, as if their connection had already begun to heal wounds she had not known existed. "I have lived my entire life, making practical decisions," she said, turning back to the mirror where their joint reflection continued to shimmer with promise. Marriage to Thomas was practical, 2 lonely people finding comfort together. My dedication to healing was practical. If I could not be beautiful, at least I could be useful. Even accepting your bargain in the Great Hall was practical, 1 life to save many. And this decision feels different. This decision is about want rather than need, about choosing joy over mere survival. I find myself paralyzed by the very possibility of such happiness. Veyric moved to stand beside her, careful not to touch, but close enough that she could feel the coolness of his presence. "Tell me your fears, that I am not worthy of such love, that this connection between us is some supernatural glamour that will fade once the transformation is complete, that I will become something monstrous and lose the very qualities that drew you to me in the first place." "All reasonable concerns," he said quietly, "though I believe each one stems from a lifetime of being told you are less than you are. In the mirror, their reflections moved closer together, and she watched as her imagined immortal self reached out to take his hand. The connection between them blazed with golden light, warm and comforting rather than consuming. "What do you see when you look at that reflection?" she asked. "I see myself as I was meant to be. Not the lonely predator I became, but the man I was before. Despair and isolation corrupted my purpose. I see myself redeemed through love rather than cursed by it." She studied his face in the mirror's strange light, noting how the centuries of pain had begun to ease from his features over the past week. "And you truly believe I could find such transformation as well?" "I believe you have already begun to find it. The woman who walked into this castle 7 days ago was magnificent but wounded, generous but guarded. The woman standing beside me now radiates a confidence and self-acceptance I suspect you have never allowed yourself to feel." The truth of his words resonated through her like a bell. She had felt the change in herself, the way their conversations had. Stripped away layers of self-doubt, the way his reverent attention had taught her to see herself through kinder eyes. Even without supernatural transformation, she was no longer the same person who had accepted sacrifice with quiet dignity. "Show me the alternative," she said to the mirror. "Show me what becomes of us if I choose mortality." The reflection shifted, showing her a different, possible future. She saw herself growing old in comfort and care, her remaining years filled with Varric's devoted attention. She saw him treasuring every moment they had together, growing more human through their connection, even as she grew frailer with age. And she saw the inevitable end, her death, leaving him once again alone, but this time carrying the memory of true love that would make his eternal isolation even more unbearable. "You would mourn me for centuries," she observed. "I would treasure the memory of you for eternity," he corrected. "But yes, losing you after finding you would be difficult." The understatement was so profound it made her heart ache. She could see in the mirror's prophecy how her mortal death would affect him, the way the light would fade from his storm-grey eyes, the way he would retreat deeper into his castle and his isolation, sustained only by the echo of their brief happiness. From a hidden alcove, she heard the soft chiming of an ancient clock marking the hours. Dawn was approaching in the world above, and with it the deadline he had originally given the villagers. The storm was ending, and decisions could no longer be postponed. "There is something else you should know," Varric said quietly. "About the transformation itself. Tell me, it is not a gentle process. The Covenant blade makes it possible to preserve the soul intact, but it cannot eliminate all pain from the change. You would experience discomfort as your mortal frame adapts to its new nature." "What kind of discomfort?" "Fire in your veins as immortal. Blood replaces mortal. The sensation of your bones strengthening, your senses expanding beyond human capacity. Most difficult of all, you will feel the moment your soul anchors itself to eternity, a pulling sensation as if something essential is being stretched beyond its natural limits." She absorbed this information with the practical calm that had sustained her through decades of healing work. "How long does it last?" "Hours, not days. And I would be with you throughout, sharing what strength I could to ease your passage. And afterward," his expression grew tender, "afterward you would be yourself but enhanced. Still Elsbeth the healer, but with abilities that could mend not just bodies but souls. Still the woman who sees beauty in broken things, but with the power to actually repair what is damaged." The mirror showed her a new vision herself, using supernatural healing abilities to tend not just physical wounds, but the deeper injuries of the heart and spirit. She saw herself working alongside Varric through the centuries, their combined powers bringing comfort and restoration to a world that desperately needed both. "We could do good together," she said, wonder threading through her voice. "We could transform the very nature of what it means to be supernatural. Instead of creatures that inspire fear, We could become beings that offer hope. The appeal of such a purpose resonated through every fiber of her being. She had spent her mortal life healing individuals. The prospect of healing on a scale measured in centuries rather than years was intoxicating. From the alcove came another chime, and she realized that time was running short. The storm outside had nearly ended, and she could feel something shifting in the very air around them, as if the castle itself was preparing for transformation or farewell. "The Heartstone amulet," Varick said suddenly, moving to yet another concealed compartment. "I had almost forgotten." He withdrew a pendant, unlike anything Elsbeth had ever seen. The chain was wrought from silver so pure it seemed to glow with its own light, while the stone at its center appeared to be carved from crystallized starlight. But as he held it up, the pendant began to pulse with a warm, golden radiance that matched the rhythm of her heartbeat. "What does it do?" "It glows in the presence of true love, not mere attraction or compatibility, but the deep soul bond that can withstand eternity. It has been in my family for 1,000 years, and it has never glowed for me before this moment." As if to prove his words, the pendant blazed brighter, its light filling the chamber with warmth that seemed to penetrate to her very bones. In that radiance, all her doubts and fears seemed petty and insignificant compared to the magnitude of what was being offered. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "It is proof," he corrected, "that what lies between us is real and lasting. Whatever choice you make, this amulet confirms that our love is genuine." The golden light pulsed between them like a living thing, and Elsbeth felt her last reservations crumbling beneath its warm certainty. She looked once more at their reflection in the moonstone mirror and saw two souls who had found their perfect complement in each other. "I have my answer," she said quietly. Varick went perfectly still, the Heartstone amulet's light reflecting in his storm-grey eyes like captured stars. "And?" She turned to face him fully, her weathered hands reaching up to frame his aristocratic face with infinite tenderness. "I choose love," she said simply. "I choose us. I choose forever." The chapel lay hidden in the deepest part of the castle, accessible only through passages so ancient that their builders had been dust for centuries before Christianity reached these mountains. Varick led her through corridors that seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat, past walls carved with symbols that predated written language. The very stones seemed to whisper of sacred purposes and transformations that transcended mortal understanding. "This place has witnessed every significant moment in my family's history," Varick explained as they walked, the covenant blade wrapped carefully in midnight blue silk and carried with reverent precision. Births, deaths, marriages, and the rare occasions when love proved strong enough to bridge the gap between mortal and immortal existence. The chapel itself took Elsbeth's breath away. It was small and intimate, carved from living rock in a style that somehow managed to be both pagan and sacred. Ancient columns supported a vaulted ceiling painted with stars that seemed to move in the torchlight, while an altar of black marble dominated the far end of the chamber. But it was the rose window above the altar that commanded her attention most completely. The window was crafted not from colored glass, but from what appeared to be crystallized flower petals, each piece catching and altar, holding the light in ways that created patterns of impossible beauty. And as they approached, Elsbeth gasped to see something extraordinary happening within the crystal matrix. A rose was blooming. "The eternal rose," Varick said softly, his voice filled with awe despite having witnessed this miracle before. "It blooms only when true transformation is at hand, when two souls are about to be joined in bonds that will endure beyond the ending of the world." The rose was unlike any flower Elsbeth had ever seen. Its petals appeared to be made of living light, shifting through shades of gold and silver and pearl that defied earthly description. As it bloomed, the entire chapel, filled with a fragrance that spoke of gardens that existed in realms beyond mortal reach. "It's magnificent," she whispered, unable to look away from the supernatural bloom. "As are you." Varric's voice carried such reverence that she turned to find him watching her rather than the miraculous flower. "I have waited 7 centuries to see the eternal rose bloom again. I had begun to believe it never would." He moved to the altar and began to unwrap the covenant blade with ceremonial precision. In the rose's ethereal light, the weapon's crystalline handle blazed like captured starlight, while its blade sang with harmonics that seemed to resonate in her very bones. "There is no shame in changing your mind," he said without looking at her, though she could hear the tension beneath his carefully controlled tone. "This is the final moment. Once we begin, there will be no turning back." Elsbeth approached the altar, her footsteps echoing softly in the sacred space. The eternal rose pulsed brighter at her approach, as if recognizing her acceptance of destiny. She placed her hands on the smooth marble surface and felt warmth flowing up through her palms, not the heat of fire, but the deeper warmth of life itself. "I am not afraid," she said, and realized with surprise that it was absolutely true. The peace that had settled over her during their final conversation had only deepened as they prepared for the ritual. "For the first time in my life, I am exactly where I belong, doing exactly what I was meant to do." Varric's expression blazed with such joy that she felt tears prick at her eyes. He moved around the altar to stand beside her, the covenant blade held reverently between them. "The ritual itself is ancient beyond measure," he explained, his voice taking on the cadence of someone reciting sacred words passed down through generations. "It requires blood freely given, words of binding spoken with absolute conviction, and the courage to release one form of existence in order to claim another." The eternal rose blazed brighter, its petals now fully opened to reveal a heart of pure radiance that seemed to contain the essence of every love song ever written, every prayer ever whispered, every hope ever held in a faithful heart. What words must be spoken? You must declare your choice before the powers that govern transformation. You must state your willingness to leave mortality behind and accept the gifts and burdens of immortal existence. And you must affirm that this choice is made from love, not fear or desperation. Elsbeth nodded, feeling the rightness of what was about to happen, settle into her bones like certainty itself. Above them, the eternal rose reached the peak of its supernatural bloom, its light now so brilliant that it seemed to fill every corner of the ancient chapel. "I am ready," she said simply. Varric raised the covenant blade, its crystalline surface reflecting the rose's radiance in patterns too complex for mortal eyes to follow. The weapon hummed with power, responding to the proximity of 2 souls prepared to claim their destiny. "Then let us begin," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Let us choose eternity together." The moment had arrived, the culmination of 7 days that had transformed them both from lonely outcasts into halves of a completed whole. As Varric began to speak the ancient words of transformation, Elsbeth felt herself standing at the threshold between her mortal existence and an immortal future that stretched beyond the boundaries of time itself. Above them, the eternal rose blazed with the light of 1,000 stars, bearing witness to love that had finally found its perfect expression in the choice to be together forever. The ancient words of transformation flowed from Varric's lips like water from a sacred spring, each syllable resonating through the chapel with power that made the very stones hum in harmony. Elsbeth felt the language washing over her, not Latin or any earthly tongue, but something far older, words that spoke directly to the soul rather than the mind. "By blood freely given and love freely chosen," he intoned, raising the covenant blade so that its crystalline surface caught the eternal rose's radiance. "I offer transformation to one whose soul calls to mine across all boundaries of mortality and time." The blade's edge drew across his palm with surgical precision, and drops of his immortal blood fell onto the black marble altar. Where they landed, the stone began to glow with the same ethereal light as the rose above them, creating a circle of radiance that pulsed with supernatural energy. "Elsbeth of Greythorne," he said, turning to face her fully, "do you come to this transformation of your own free will, seeking not escape from mortality, but celebration of love eternal?" "I do," she replied, her voice steady and clear despite the magnitude of the moment. "Do you understand that this choice cannot be undone, that the path you choose now will determine the nature of your existence for all eternity?" "I understand and accept this truth willingly." "Then place your hand upon the altar and speak the words that will bind your soul to immortal purpose." Elsbeth pressed her weathered palm against the glowing marble, feeling warmth flow up through her fingers like liquid starlight. The words came to her without conscious thought, as if they had been written in her heart from the moment of her birth. "I choose love over fear," she declared, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I choose forever over the safety of familiar endings. I choose to transform not from desperation, but from the desire to spend eternity worthy of the love that has found me." The moment the final word left her lips, the chapel exploded with light. The eternal rose blazed like a captive sun, while the altar beneath their joined hands became a pool of radiant energy that seemed to contain all the colors that had ever existed and several that had not. Varric drew the covenant blade across her palm with the same precise care he had shown his own flesh, and when her mortal blood mingled with his immortal essence on the altar's surface, the very air around them began to sing. The transformation began as warmth spreading, from her heart outward through every vein and artery. But warmth quickly became heat, and heat became fire that raced through her bloodstream like liquid lightning. Elsbeth gasped as the sensation intensified, her mortal frame struggling to contain energies never meant for earthly flesh. "Hold fast to who you are," Varric urged, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek with infinite gentleness. "The fire will try to consume everything mortal within you, but you must preserve the essence that makes you Elsbeth. Your compassion, your wisdom, your capacity for love, these things must survive the transformation." The pain reached levels that should have driven her to unconsciousness, but somehow she remained aware of every sensation as her body remade itself on the cellular level. Her bones sang as they strengthened beyond mortal limitations. Her senses exploded with new awareness. She could hear Varric's heartbeat, smell the stone dust that had settled in the chapel's corners. Centuries ago, feel the movement of air currents too subtle for human perception. And then, just as she thought the fire in her veins might consume her entirely, something else began to happen. Above her head, light began to coalesce into a tangible form, threads of radiance, weaving themselves into a delicate circlet that pulsed with the same ethereal glow as the eternal rose. "The phoenix feather crown," Varric breathed, wonder threading through his voice. "It appears only when transformation has been accepted completely, when the one being reborn has proven worthy of immortal power." The crown settled onto Elsbeth's head with the weight of destiny fulfilled. The moment it touched her silver hair, the agonizing fire in her veins transformed into something else entirely, a warmth that spoke not of destruction but of rebirth, not of ending but of glorious beginning. Her transformation was complete. Elsbeth opened eyes that now blazed with supernatural radiance and looked upon the world through vision that could perceive not just the physical realm, but the deeper currents of energy and emotion that flowed beneath the surface of reality. She could see the love radiating from Varric like golden light, could feel the ancient power that dwelt within the chapel's stones, could sense the very pulse of life that connected all things. "How do you feel?" Varric asked softly. She flexed her fingers and marveled at the strength that flowed through them, not just physical power, but the enhanced ability to heal and comfort that came from her supernatural heritage, finally awakening to its full potential. "I feel complete," she said, her voice carrying new harmonics that resonated with the same otherworldly beauty as the eternal rose. "For the first time in my existence, I feel like I am exactly who I was always meant to be." Vayric's smile blazed, brighter than the supernatural light that filled the chapel. He lifted her transformed hands to his lips and pressed a reverent kiss to her knuckles. "Then let us greet eternity together, my love." The eternal rose reached the pinnacle of its bloom, its radiance blessing their union as two immortal souls finally claimed the love they had been destined to share since time began. Spring arrived in Greythorne 3 days after the transformation, though the villagers would never understand the connection between their sudden deliverance from supernatural winter and the miracle that had taken place in the depths of Castle Ravenshallow. The snow melted with unnatural swiftness, revealing green grass and early wildflowers that should not have bloomed for months. The air itself seemed cleaner, warmer, touched by a benediction that spoke of ancient powers turned toward healing rather than harm. In the great hall where terror had once reigned, the villagers found only empty spaces and the lingering fragrance of roses that had no earthly source. The massive doors stood open to the mountain air, and sunlight streamed through windows that had been dark for centuries. Of the vampire lord who had demanded their sacrifice, there was no sign save for a sense of peace that settled over the castle like a blessing. Mayor Aldrich led a cautious expedition through the abandoned halls, his political mind already calculating how to spin their deliverance into a tale that would enhance his own reputation. But even he fell silent when they reached the great hearth where their ordeal had begun. Carved into the stone mantelpiece, as if it had always been there, were 2 intertwined roses, one wild and earthbound, the other ethereal and supernatural, forever joined in perfect harmony. "She saved us all," Mira whispered, tears streaming down her beautiful face as she touched the carved roses with trembling fingers. "Even when we abandoned her to her fate, she found a way to save us all." But the villagers, in their limited understanding, could never have imagined the true nature of that salvation. Far beneath their feet, in chambers that existed outside the normal flow of time, Elsbeth and Veyric were discovering what it meant to be perfect complements in immortal form. The first miracle was the rings. As dawn broke over the mountain on their 3rd day as bonded immortals, they found the united covenant rings waiting for them on the altar where their transformation had taken place. The bands were wrought from metals that had no earthly name, his a deep blue-black that captured starlight, hers a warm silver gold that seemed to hold the essence of healing sunlight. When worn, the rings pulsed in perfect synchronization with their heartbeats, visible proof of the bond that now connected them beyond the reach of time or circumstance. "They appeared while we slept," Veyric marveled, sliding the ethereal band onto his finger, where it settled as if it had always belonged there. "The legends speak of such rings, but I had begun to think them mere fantasy." Elsbeth examined her own ring with wonder, watching as the metal seemed to flow like liquid light around her finger. "What do they signify?" "Completion, recognition by the forces that govern supernatural existence, that we have achieved perfect unity. As long as these rings remain, our bond cannot be broken by any power in heaven or earth." The second miracle was the transformation of her abilities. Where once Elsbeth had possessed the gift of healing mortal ailments, she now found herself capable of mending wounds that went far deeper than flesh. When she touched Veyric's hand, she could feel the ancient sorrows that had carved themselves into his soul, and with gentle persistence, she began to heal damage that had accumulated over centuries of isolation and regret. "You're taking away the pain, he said with wonder, watching as lines of old anguish faded from around his storm-grey eyes. Not just covering it or helping me forget, but actually removing it from my soul. Because pain was never meant to be carried alone, she replied, marveling at the way her enhanced abilities allowed her to perceive and treat injuries that had nothing to do with the physical realm. Love is the most powerful healing force in existence, and now I can channel it directly. The third miracle was the castle itself. Castle Ravenshollow, which had brooded in darkness for centuries, began to transform around them. Tapestries that had been faded and torn restored themselves to their original splendor. Windows that had been shuttered against the light opened to reveal views of gardens that bloomed in supernatural beauty. The very stones seemed to sing with contentment, as if the ancient keep had been waiting for love to return to its halls. "This is how it was always meant to be," Varick explained as they walked through chambers that now glowed with warm welcome rather than Gothic menace. "My ancestors built this place as a sanctuary for supernatural beings who chose love over predation. It has been waiting for us to fulfill its original purpose." On the seventh day after her transformation, Elsbeth stood once more before the moonstone mirror, but what she saw there exceeded even her enhanced imagination. The woman looking back at her was magnificent beyond mortal comprehension, not because her physical form had changed dramatically, but because every aspect of her being now radiated the confidence and power that came from knowing herself completely loved and entirely worthy. Beside her, Varick appeared not as the tortured creature who had emerged from the crypts, but as the noble healer he had been meant to become. Together, their reflections showed two immortal beings who had chosen to use their supernatural gifts in service of love and healing rather than fear and domination. "What will we do with eternity?" she asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. "We will heal," he said simply. "Not just each other, but everyone whose path crosses ours. We will show the world that supernatural power can be a force for restoration rather than destruction. And we will love," she added, turning to face him directly. "Deeply, completely, without reservation or fear. For all eternity." The united covenant rings blazed brighter on their fingers, sealing the promise with light that would endure beyond the ending of stars. Outside, spring continued its supernatural progress through Greythorne, bringing new life to a world that had forgotten what it meant to hope for miracles. In the depths of Castle Ravenshollow, two souls who had once been judged as unworthy by a blind world had found their perfect home in each other's hearts. They had transformed not just themselves, but the very nature of what love could accomplish when given the courage to claim its full potential. Their story was complete, but their eternity was just beginning.